Welcome to Spectral Shadows. This is the place where the stories don't just haunt your mind, they follow you into the dark. Before the whispers begin, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it? Midnight? Or closer to the hour when shadows move on their own? If you're brave enough to continue, prove it. Like this video, subscribe to Spectral Shadows and leave a comment with your time and location, so we'll know exactly where to find you. Now, let's open the door to tonight's nightmare. Story number 1. I hung up the phone as I stared into my wife's eyes with the biggest smile I had ever had. "Well, what did they say, John?" my wife inquired. I was still in shock. Joy, no, relief, took over my body. "They found a match," I stuttered. My wife, Sarah, leapt forward, clutching her arms around my neck. I gently reached up and rubbed her back. It was over. I had found a match. After 6 months of slowly dying, hoping and praying to find a matching kidney, I finally found one. I haven't felt this happy since our marriage. That phone call was one of the greatest moments of my life. Well, that's what I thought. Little did I know the gates of hell had just opened, and my life would never be the same. I'm sure you're all expecting a story of how the kidney transplant failed, or maybe some horror story of how I was awake during the surgery. God, I wish that was the case. It would have been so much easier, so much quicker, so much less painful. Shit, even a failed transplant would have been better. I probably would have only lasted a few more months. Death would have been relieving in comparison. What I got instead was nightmares. Actual, literal nightmares. They began shortly after I left the hospital and started simple enough. I would see flashes in my dreams. A woman screaming in the corner as she held her baby. A blood-soaked floor. A man laughing psychotically. The sound of knives sharpening. And, briefly, the glimpse of a man strapped to a chair with black tape over his mouth, eyes bulging in horror as he witnessed a violent murder. There was little meaning to them, and there was no cohesion to the dreams. It was just glimpses. They were different, though, than any other dreams I had. They were short flashes like that of a slideshow, but they were incredibly vivid. I could describe in detail what the woman looked like and what she wore. I could hear her voice shrieking in terror. I could picture the blood on the floor and the man strapped to a chair as if I had just seen them in person. I could even smell the sickening scent of iron in the air from the blood. I told Sarah about the dreams. She didn't make much of them. She said they were likely the result of the anesthesia or my body healing from surgery, and shouldn't be a concern. "Anesthesia?" I questioned. "It's been a week. I think all the anesthesia is gone." "Well, it could still be your body healing," she retorted, "or it could be anxiety. We've waited months for you to find a match. I'm sure you were worried about it failing. Also, you've always been terrified of doctors." This was true. I hated doctors. For years, doctors have been telling me I have hypertension when they take my blood pressure, only for me to explain I have white coat syndrome. "Yeah, you're probably right," I said. "I know I am. I always am," she said, smiling softly. No matter how distressed I was, that smile always calmed me. What else could it be? I nodded and reclined on the couch. It was Saturday, which meant it was movie night. Throughout our 23 years of marriage, we made it a point to have date nights. As we got older and grouchier, most of those date nights turned into staying home and watching something. Still, I couldn't quite shake the unease I felt. I don't know how to describe it, but something felt wrong, though I had relaxed my mind. and resolved myself to just experiencing post-op anxiety. That didn't stop the nightmares. In fact, they got worse. I no longer only dreamed of the same horror scene of the blood-soaked room. Now I would see different ones. Sometimes I would dream of a young man, maybe 30, with long black hair being hung by one finger from a bridge, crying and begging for his life. I could hear his bones in his finger break and see the flesh tear as the thin rope cut into his finger. Other times, I would see a family, all tied to lawn chairs inside a barn as it went up in flames. I watched as they screamed, as the flames engulfed them and melted the skin from their faces. One of the worst I saw was a woman held at gunpoint as her, I assume, boyfriend or husband, shot himself in the head. I suspect whoever held the gun forced him to do it, or else he would kill his wife or girlfriend. They were all drastically different killings, but aside from being gruesome and horrific, they all had two things in common. There was always a man laughing maniacally, and there was always the man tied to a chair being forced to watch. This went on for weeks. I would tell my wife about the dreams, and though disturbed, she would always conclude that it must be anxiety, or that I had watched too many horror films. It's not just anxiety, I yelled during an argument over the dreams. It's not horror movies either. I've watched horror my entire life and have never had dreams like this. Well, what do you want to do about it then? She retorted. I sat and clasped my head in my hands. I felt as if I may cry for the first time in decades. I don't know, but I can't keep having dreams like this. I can barely sleep anymore. Should you see a therapist? Sarah asked. A therapist? How much is it going to cost for some PhD to tell me it's all because of my childhood? I snidely responded. Will you stop? She said. Your insurance covers therapy. Do you have any other ideas? Wouldn't you like to sleep again? I sighed. I always thought of therapists as scams. But what other options did I have? These nightmares were making my life hell, and went far beyond not being able to sleep. I couldn't get the images out of my mind. They were always there. Having constant, vivid images of the most gruesome murders possible really messed with one's psyche. Fine. I'll look for one tomorrow. It didn't take long for me to find a psychiatrist. As it happens, America is experiencing something of a mental health epidemic. Psychiatrists were plentiful and abundant. I found one covered by my insurance with good reviews. A slender lady who looked to be somewhere in her mid-30s. I told her, the psychiatrist, all about my dreams and how I started experiencing them after the surgery. I explained that I could see them in vivid detail, and they were making my awakened life a nightmare. She went through the usual checklist. She asked if I had ever experienced anything like this before, if I had a history of anxiety, if I was on any painkillers after the surgery. I answered no to them all. She had no concrete answers, but she said it was likely that my brain was working out the trauma of literally dying for months with a failing kidney. She concluded that with death constantly lurking in my mind, it was likely that now that it was over, I was experiencing something like post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't really believe her, but she prescribed me some medications, one for anxiety and one for sleep. If I can finally sleep, I'll take whatever she gives me, I thought. As it turns out, the meds did nothing. Well, actually, I guess they did, because the nightmares only got worse. Every couple of days, I would experience a new episode in more graphic detail than the last. Two of them really struck me. One was a man, crying, being forced to eat something raw. Even in my sleep, I could feel the bile rise in my throat. Whatever that was, it wasn't beef. The second was another man as he was shoved into a wood chipper. I'll spare you the details on that one. Still, As with all of them, there was always that haunting laughter and a man strapped to a chair who seemed to slightly change between each dream. He gradually became more worn in appearance and skinnier. I reckoned he had lost 50 pounds throughout all the nightmares. Nothing eased the terror that consumed my nights. I was lucky to get 2 hours of sleep. I spent most of the nights lying in bed awake, sweating profusely. These had turned into night terrors, and I could no longer stand them. I even tried sleeping during the day to see if that would help, but I would still have nightmares. My wife was no help. She insisted I keep seeing the therapist and taking the meds. I put my foot down and refused. Whatever was going on, therapy wasn't the solution. Since this ordeal began when I got my kidney transplant, I decided to start there. Only problem was, I didn't know how to begin there. I had no clue what the cause of the dreams were, or how the kidney was connected. But it's all I had. After all, what the hell could a kidney have to do with nightmares? I racked my brain trying to figure out what happened around that time. Had I seen some news story about a serial killer before the surgery? While I was unconscious in the hospital, were murder victims being treated that my subconscious picked up on? I investigated both of these and found nothing. Finally, with no other possible avenues, I decided to contact my doctor who had done the surgery. I wanted to know who the kidney came from, which evidently standard surgical doctors don't know. At first, he wanted to know why I wanted to know this. So I told him I wanted to send a gift to the family as a thank you for saving my life. Finally, after a longer than wanted conversation, he sent me some list with what looked like serial numbers through email. He told me which number sequence my kidney belonged to and told me to contact the doctor in charge of organ donations, the one who extracted them from the corpses. It took a while, but I finally got in touch with the doctor I was looking for. I gave him the same story I had given the other doctor, and also gave him the numbers of the donor I was looking for. He checked his database and came back with the name Samuel Horn. Samuel Horn. This was the guy whose kidney I now carried, the man who saved my life. Though I had never heard the name before, something about it seemed so familiar. It was as if I had heard the name 1,000 times. I Googled the name, and it didn't take long for me to discover who he was. I live in Boston, which is where Samuel Horn was from as well. Evidently, he was an investigator who went missing 2 years ago with no trace. Upon investigating the police reports, his case went cold, and he was listed as a missing person. That is, until a few months ago when he was found on the outskirts of Boston, lying dead in the snow. The cause of death: a single stab wound to the temple. It was a sad story, but none of that's what got me. What bothered me instead was that I instantly recognized him. He was the man from my dreams, the one strapped to a chair who was present during all the killings. My mind was racing. What do I do? I couldn't tell my wife about this. She would just think I was nuts. What would I even tell her? Honey, that kidney I got is haunted and belonged to an investigator who was murdered. I think I'm witnessing the murders he was forced to watch before he was killed. I paced around for hours. I must have smoked 2 packs of Marlboros during that time, trying to decide what to do. Why is this happening? Why am I having these dreams? What could they mean? I thought to myself. The only explanation I could muster was that Samuel must have wanted me to see them. For some reason, he wanted me to have these nightmares. My guess is he was investigating a serial killer, and he wanted me to finish it, to turn this person in as he was unable. How I, a 49-year-old electrician, would do this, I don't know. Maybe eventually, I would see the laughing man in the nightmares. Then I would at least know what he looked like to tell the police. Until then, I would just have to endure them. It's not as if I had a choice in the matter anyway. Weeks passed, with no relief. Every night I would dream of some horrible murder, each more vivid than the last. I was never able to see the laughing man, though. He always stayed somewhere out of my limited view. That is, until one night, exactly 9 months after my surgery, I saw him, and I was not prepared for it. It happened abruptly. I was having a nightmare of a man being lit on fire, when suddenly the laughing man popped into my view, clear as day. I was only able to see the man for a few moments before I jumped awake, with my heart pounding. As I felt the drumming in my chest, I thought I might have a heart attack. I started to hyperventilate when my wife awoke. "Honey, what's wrong?" she yelled. I didn't reply. I was in disbelief. The man I saw, he was me. I never went back to sleep. It took over an hour for me to convince my wife I didn't need to call 911. I stayed awake the entire night, thinking about what I had witnessed. How? How have I been killing people? I thought to myself. As soon as my wife awoke the next morning, I told her about the dream. She brushed it off as nothing and just a nightmare, but I insisted. I told her all about Samuel Horn and how he was the man I saw tied up in every one of my dreams. She was visibly shaken, but she still tried to make sense of it. She told me I should take a vacation and lay out of work for a while, rest my mind. I refused. I already knew what I was going to do, and that was turn myself into the police. I don't know how I was doing these murders, but I saw myself there. Initially, the police thought I was crazy. That is, until I gave them details of dozens of murders that the public had no information on. They checked their records, and all the information I gave them was accurate. Still, there was no evidence of my involvement in the murders, so instead of prison, I was locked in a psychiatric hospital. I spent weeks in this hospital. The nightmares had finally stopped. The doctors and the police weren't entirely convinced I was the murderer, but they knew I knew something and wanted to know how. I told them it was my dreams, which nobody took seriously. They eventually diagnosed me with schizophrenia and wanted to check my family history for mental illnesses. I told them about my family, which turned up nothing. No history of any mental issues aside from an uncle with chronic depression. That is, until one of the officers sat me down for an interview. "John, are you aware you are adopted?" The officer inquired. "Adopted?" I asked. "No, I am not adopted." "Well, as it turns out, you are." I was shocked, as if I needed more life-altering news. I felt a tinge of sadness for a moment as I realized my parents weren't my biological mother and father. Your parents adopted you when you were 4 months old. Apparently, your birth mother couldn't care for you both. "You both?" I asked. My head started to spin. This, along with everything else, was too much. "Yes, you both. John, you have an identical twin brother who is wanted on federal charges." Story number 2. He would tell them every Saturday night. I looked forward to them every single week, and often leapt onto the couch and pestered him to start it already. The stories varied from being about haunted pirate ships that still splash about in the open sea hundreds of years later with no port in sight, to old schoolhouses that were all shut down 50 years ago after the mysterious disappearances of several children. One night, however, my grandfather said that he wasn't up for telling a complete story, as he had just gotten over a slight cold and wanted to rest. Instead, he told me a short little tale that he claimed was real. He asked me if I knew about the undead, like vampires and ghosts, and how they couldn't see their own reflections. I nodded in agreement, having read all about this piece of vampire folklore in more Goosebumps books than I can remember. "Well," he said, taking a seat on the couch and taking off his eyeglasses, There is actually a very good reason for that, Chloe. You see, mirrors are not simply pieces of glass that show a reflection. They are windows to another world, a world far different from our own. A world some people call the afterlife. The person you think is your reflection is actually your spirit, waiting for you to join with it upon your death. Until then, their job is to keep you out of their world. But you know why I mentioned vampires? I shook my head, enthralled, and wondering in anticipation what he was going to say. When they became undead, their spirit vanished. He snapped his fingers in the air and made a whooshing sound. Gone, just like that. Because of this, Chloe, there is no one to keep them out of the other world, the afterlife. They can freely move back and forth between each world like it's an open doorway. But the truly scary thing is, you know how a vampire turns you into one by biting you? I nodded, becoming even more anxious and fearful. That isn't exactly true. What they really do is go into the other world, find your spirit, wait for it to move in front of a mirror, and kill it. He suddenly shouted, nearly making me jump off of the couch. Then you become one of them. He then leaned in, trying to make me sweat a little bit more than he usually would, telling these stories. So you have to wonder, are any of them on the other side right now, looking for you? He grinned and told me to brush my teeth and go to bed, leaving me shakily heading upstairs. While I stood in the bathroom, brushing my molars, I finished up and put my toothbrush down, inching closer to my reflection. Curious, I pressed my hand against it, then moved it around, trying to trick my reflection into making the wrong movement. After a few seconds of doing this, I gave up, telling myself that even if Grandpa's story were true, no one would want my spirit anyway. I was just some random little girl who hadn't done anything wrong. Only moments later, however, my peripheral vision caught something in the mirror. It looked like a hand beginning to grip the doorframe. Just as I saw something beginning to lean in, I looked back at myself in the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, looking terrified, and blinked. At that point, I blacked out. I don't know if I fainted or was knocked out by whatever that thing was, but I don't remember anything after that. I woke up a few days later in the hospital. My parents and grandfather found me and took me there after my dad noticed a few cut marks on my head. He figured I smacked it off of the sharp counter or something when I fell. Grandpa never said anything when he was in the room with us. He just stared at me with his arms folded, with an expression on his face that I couldn't quite read. I couldn't tell if he was upset or intrigued. After a while, my parents left to go get some lunch, leaving me alone with my grandfather. He pulled his chair up next to my bed and sat down, clasping his hands together, interlocking his fingers. I stared at him for a moment, hoping he would know how to help me. I mean, if he knew so much about that story, he'd have to know how to fix it, right? He then smirked a bit, with a faint glow in his eyes, and reassuringly rested a hand on my shoulder. Don't you worry, Chloe. Grandpa's gonna help you get through this. It's not so bad once you get used to it. He was right, though. 12 years of being stuck as a 9-year-old girl, and I really don't mind it. Story number 3. Before I get completely into the story, I must highlight the fact that this story is 100% true. I experienced this story, and my best friend and I have only shared it with a few people. Edwin Shaw Memorial Hospital can be found in Lakemore, Ohio. Edwin Shaw Hospital was closed in 2010. All functions stopped within, so the building was promptly shut down and abandoned. My best friend and I are urban explorers. We like to find old abandoned buildings and explore them. This story has inspired us to continue exploring, but we now take cameras for proof. One day, in the middle of June 2016, my best friend, Chase, picked me up and told me he had something to show me. It turned out that Chase had heard of Edwin Shaw Memorial Hospital, and he wanted to take me there to explore it. Edwin Shaw sits about 30 minutes away from my house, and the main buildings sit farther back from the property. Chase and I parked our car at a golf course nearby and began to sneak our way onto the property. We got to the main building completely fine, but there was tall grass everywhere. We dodged our way around piles of trash and debris and made our way inside. As soon as we entered the building, the first thing that was noticeable was the temperature change. Although the building had been closed for 6 long years, it still felt as if the building was air-conditioned heavily. We welcomed the cool air and continued on into the hospital. As we entered the building, we found a staircase in front of us, one leading up and one leading down, a front lobby area to our left, and hospital rooms to our right. My friend and I, without hesitation, walked quickly through the doorway to our right and entered the darkness. The first thing I noticed in the hallway of the hospital was the graffiti. There was graffiti with a simple black spray paint can over every single inch of the entire hallway. There were messages written, hearts drawn, and even warnings to leave while you still could. We continued on, because graffiti is something we have experienced at many other abandoned places. As we continued to walk, we quickly started to realize the incredible amounts of broken glass on the floor. The crunch of the broken glass under my tennis shoes was so loud, I could barely think. As we continued walking, I started looking down to reassure myself of my steps. And then I saw it. All the way down the hallway was a trail of what looked like blood. I want to clarify that it was not as if someone had dragged a body down the hallway. It was as if someone had cut themselves very badly and had been running down the hallway while it dripped profusely. Chase and I noticed the blood almost exactly at the same time, and we both stopped in the middle of the hallway. We stood there listening for what felt like hours, though it had only been a few moments. It was still very dark, so we were not sure if the trail we saw was indeed blood. Upon further investigation with a phone light, we confirmed that the trail down the hallway was blood. We turned around and looked down the hallway that we had been walking down, and we began to investigate the blood trail. The blood trail led all the way down the hallway to the last room on the left. The door was closed. Chase and I decided to open the door and determine what had happened. As we opened the old, rusty door, a very loud, whiny creak echoed through the empty hospital. The trail of blood led directly to a floor-to-ceiling window that was entirely shattered. The bottom of the window was only about 3 feet higher than the dirt on the ground outside, but the window had obviously been shattered outwards, and shards of glass littered the ground. It was clear to Chase and me that the person who had been cut had not been harmed by anything in the room. So we turned back into the hallway and followed the blood trail the other way. I do not know if any of you reading this has ever had the pleasure of exploring an abandoned hospital, but I must highlight the fact that abandoned hospitals are very creepy. As we walked back out into the hallway, we turned our phone lights on and began to walk the other way, still following the trail of blood. The blood led all the way down to the end of the hallway and made a left in the last doorway. As Chase and I approached the doorway, we heard dripping water echoing in the distance. As we turned left into the doorway, we discovered that it was the doorway to stairs leading downwards. We were already on the ground level, so these were the stairs to the basement. The blood trail was very clearly defined all the way down the stairs and into the pitch black of the basement. Chase and I stood there for a few minutes deciding whether or not we should follow the blood trail. We love exploring, but we are always very concerned about our personal well-being. After some heated discussion, Chase convinced me to enter the basement. We had no official flashlights, except for the ones on our phones. We had no camera to record what we were doing, and we had no way to defend ourselves. Against my better judgment, we entered the basement. The first thing I noticed was the cold and the humidity. Within seconds of being in the basement, my shirt clung tightly to my figure because of the humidity, and beads of sweat formed on my forehead despite the cold. We continued on, Chase in the lead. The basement looked just like the hospital above us, only the slight change in temperature and sound because we were underground. After following the blood trail through a few doors, we found that the basement was not like other basements. The ceiling was low and there was a small door fashioned in the concrete in front of us. The door was old and white and had the orange tint of rust that was inevitably settling in because of the constant humidity. As we opened the door at the bottom of the stairs, there was a sharp blast of wind that came ripping through the open doorway. It carried the musty scent of a moldy, nasty tunnel. With the flashlights on our phones, we could see the blood trail leading down the tunnel. We kept on walking, constantly checking in front and behind of us for anything amiss. After walking for about a minute, we heard subtle noises coming towards us from down the tunnel a ways. As we continued, we approached a propped open door in the middle of the tunnel. The trail of blood seemed to come from the propped open door. As we got closer to the door, the stench hit us. It was the worst smell I have ever smelled. It smelled like rotting meat mixed with the musty smell of the tunnel. Chase and I looked at one another and simultaneously walked through the open door. What we found inside, I can only describe as horror. The room had a low ceiling and no light at all. With the light of the flashlights, we could tell that the room was entirely empty aside from debris on the floor, and it was big enough to fit 25 people comfortably. As our flashlights hit the floor, we realized that the debris on the floor was not debris. Scattered all over the floor were the carcasses of animals. It looked as if they had been ripped to shreds. Squirrels, cats, dogs, and what looked like deer. Every one of the carcasses sat in a uniform position. Taking a closer look, it was a pentagram on the ground, and each carcass of an animal marked one of the star points on the pentagram. The smell was unbearable, and the air was ice cold. There was so much blood on the ground. In the center of the pentagram, there was a piece of paper with scribbled writing on it. Chase and I realized what lay on the floor in front of us, and we both bolted. I have never run faster in my life. We got out of the building, back into the heat of the summer, but that did not stop us. We sprinted all the way back to the car and sped out of there. The only reason that I wanted to share this story is that I recently saw in the local news that Edwin Shaw Memorial Hospital started destruction on December 1, 2016. I encourage you to research Edwin Shaw Memorial Hospital. You can find plenty of information, pictures, and videos of the place. You've reached the end, but the shadows haven't left you. If this story unsettled you, prove you survived. Like this video, subscribe to Spectral Shadows, and leave a comment with the part that haunted you most. The darkness is always waiting, and so are we. Until next time, don't turn off the lights.